She pulled the ring off her finger right there in front of 200 people, and she did it slowly, deliberately, like she wanted everyone in that ballroom to see exactly what she thought of him. Vanessa Caldwell held the diamond up between two fingers, the chandelier light catching it just so, and turned to face Damian Sterling with a smile that had nothing warm in it. "I'm sorry," she said, loud enough that the string quartet stopped playing, "but I need a man who actually matters in this city." She set the ring on the edge of his champagne glass like it was something she'd borrowed and grown tired of. The applause started almost immediately. No one looked at Damian's face. If they had, they might have noticed that he wasn't crushed. He was watching. If this story already has your attention, you're not alone. Thousands of viewers just like you have been following along, and every single part of this journey gets more intense. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now, and don't forget to like this video. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It genuinely means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that ballroom, because what happened next is something none of those guests will forget for the rest of their lives. The Hargrove Hotel on Fifth Avenue had hosted its share of spectacles over the decades: debutante balls, political fundraisers, the kind of engagements that got photographed for the society pages of 3 different magazines. But the Sterling Caldwell Engagement Gala on the last Friday of October would be talked about in a different register entirely. Not with admiration, with the particular low-grade thrill that comes when someone publicly bleeds. The evening had started the way these things always start. Overpriced wine, catered food arranged to look effortless, and people dressed to communicate net worth rather than taste. The guest list ran to 200 names, most of them culled from the overlapping worlds of Manhattan finance, real estate, and whatever passed for media influence these days. Vanessa Caldwell had designed the evening herself, down to the centerpieces, white orchids, which she'd read somewhere signified ambition and refinement. She'd told the event planner she wanted the room to feel aspirational. The planner had nodded and charged her accordingly. Damian Sterling had arrived 10 minutes late, which Vanessa had privately clocked as a small embarrassment. He'd come alone, without an assistant or a driver hovering nearby, wearing a suit that was well made but not flashy. He didn't work a room the way Vanessa did. He didn't have her gift for moving from cluster to cluster, laughing at the right moments, touching someone's arm to seal a moment of connection. He found a spot near the bar, ordered something non-alcoholic, and talked quietly with whoever drifted his way, never performing, never positioning. She'd noticed this about him before, of course. In the 14 months they'd been together, she'd never fully been able to explain away the nagging sense that he didn't quite fit the life she was building. He was kind. He was steady. He was genuinely funny in the dry, understated way that caught you off guard. He was a devoted father to his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, who called Vanessa Miss Nessa, with a shyness that had, in the early months, made Vanessa feel something she couldn't quite name. But he wasn't impressive in the way Manhattan required you to be impressive. He didn't have a title that landed right. When people asked what he did, his answer, private investments mostly, was the kind of answer that read as evasive to anyone who thought money and status were the same thing. Vanessa had started noticing the way certain people looked at him at these events, or rather, the way they didn't look at him. The polite misdirection, the subtle repositioning toward more interesting conversations. She told herself it didn't matter. She'd told herself that for a long time. But something had shifted in the past few weeks, specifically after a dinner with her college roommate Claire, who had married a hedge fund manager and moved into a townhouse on the Upper East Side and seemed to assess everything in life through the lens of what it said about you. Claire had asked about Damian over the appetizers, and when Vanessa described him, his quietness, his refusal to network, the way he seemed almost allergic to drawing attention to himself, Claire had set down her fork and said, "Vanessa, you built Caldwell Solutions from nothing. You are that woman in every room you walk into. Does he fit that picture?" She hadn't answered out loud, but the question had stayed. Now, standing in the middle of her own engagement party, watching Damian nurse a sparkling water near the window that overlooked Fifth Avenue, Vanessa Caldwell made a decision. She would say later, to Claire, to herself, in the private mental accounting she did in the car home that night, that she hadn't planned it, that it had simply happened, that something inside her had reached a point it couldn't hold anymore, and the words had come out before she could weigh them. This was almost certainly not true. She had been rehearsing something, In the wordless way the mind rehearses things it intends to do for at least 3 days. She crossed the room. Not toward him, not directly. She angled first toward a cluster of people that included Robert Vance, the managing director at Keller Morgan, and his wife, because she wanted witnesses she respected. Then she turned toward Damien and touched his elbow. "Can we talk for a second?" she said. Her voice was warm. Later, he would think about that. The warmth of her voice, right until the moment it wasn't warm at all. He set down his glass and gave her his attention. He had that quality. She had always noticed it. When Damien looked at you, he actually looked at you. No scanning the room for someone more useful, just genuine attention. "Of course," he said. She had intended to move them somewhere quieter, or she'd told herself she intended that. But in the moment, she stopped where they were, well within earshot of the Vances, of her colleague Patricia from the executive floor, of the food journalist from the New Yorker who'd been invited on a whim and who was, at that precise moment, very alert. The string quartet was between pieces, that brief window of silence that occurs when one song ends and the next hasn't begun. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Vanessa said. Not loudly, but not quietly either. Damien watched her. Something in his face shifted, subtle, like a card being turned over, but he didn't speak. "About us. About what we are. About what I—" She stopped, and the pause itself was a kind of performance, whether or not she meant it to be. "I need more, Damien. From a partner. From the person I'm going to build a life with." She glanced down at her left hand. "I need someone who actually has weight in this world. Influence. Someone this city, these people, respect." The silence around them had begun to expand. That particular silence of a crowd realizing something real is happening, that this isn't a toast or a lighthearted story. This is the actual thing. Damien said quietly, "Vanessa." "No." Her voice was still controlled, almost gentle, which made it worse. "I'm sorry. I really am. You're a good man. But I deserve someone who matters, someone who belongs in the room." She reached up and removed the ring, not frantically, with the calm of someone who has made up their mind entirely. She placed it on the edge of his champagne glass, his untouched champagne glass, she noted. He'd been drinking sparkling water all night, another small detail that had accumulated into something larger in her mind, and stepped back. The moment that followed was approximately 4 seconds long. In those 4 seconds, Damien looked at the ring, then at her, then at the room that had gone quiet in a way that was no longer accidental. 200 faces pointed in their direction. The string quartet had still not resumed. Then someone started clapping. Not sarcastically, or not entirely. It was the kind of applause that crowds generate when they've been waiting for permission to respond, and a braver person has finally given it to them. A woman near the back said audibly, "Good for her." A man laughed, once, a sharp sound. The applause spread and became something. Damien stood in the middle of it. He did not try to take the ring back. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the floor the way a humiliated man looks at the floor when he's trying to find somewhere else to exist. He looked at Vanessa for a long moment, and whatever he was feeling, it was not the thing the room thought he was feeling. And then he reached over and picked up the ring from the edge of his glass. He put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. He buttoned the button. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. Then he set his glass on the nearest tray, nodded at no one in particular, and walked toward the exit. The room let him go. Patricia Huang, who had worked at Caldwell Solutions for 4 years and had seen Vanessa operate in every imaginable professional context, found herself watching Damien Sterling's retreating figure with an odd tightness in her chest. She couldn't have explained it. The man was a nobody, by every relevant metric. He ran some kind of private portfolio. He had a kid. He'd never once mentioned a single impressive connection or dropped a name worth dropping. Vanessa was right, probably, in a strict accounting of resources kind of way. But there was something about the way he'd left, the absence of drama, the lack of any attempt to recover himself publicly or protest or fall apart. She'd watched powerful men absorb rejection in this city before, and they always did something, got loud or went cold, or made the woman feel small in return. Damien had done none of those things. He'd just left. Patricia picked up a fresh glass of wine from a passing tray and told herself it was nothing. Vanessa was her boss. Vanessa knew what she was doing. This was fine. Outside, the October air was sharp and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Damien walked 3 blocks before he stopped. He stood at the corner of 53rd and 6th and looked up at the building across the street, a glass tower with a logo he recognized, because he recognized most logos in this part of the city in the way you recognize handwriting you've seen before. He stood there for a while. Not grieving, exactly. Not grieving either. Something in between that doesn't have a clean name. He thought about Lily. She'd been asleep when he left. Her babysitter settled in with a book and instructions about the nightlight situation. Lily had asked him that morning if the party was going to be one of the fancy ones, and he'd said yes, and she'd wrinkled her nose. She had strong feelings about fancy things, and said, "You look the same in fancy places as regular places, Daddy. That's good." He'd kissed the top of her head and not told her what he was really thinking. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to his attorney. 4 words. Set the timer. Monday. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and started walking toward the parking garage. He didn't feel broken. He felt, in the strange and unsettling way of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down, something that was close to relief. The morning after this gala, Manhattan's social networks, which operated partly through actual social media and partly through the older, more reliable infrastructure of brunch tables and coffee meetings, were full of the story. The engaged woman who'd ended it publicly, the quiet fiancé who'd walked out without a scene, the ring on the champagne glass. A woman who'd been standing 3 feet away had filmed it on her phone, and the video was making the rounds on several private group chats by 10 a.m. Vanessa woke up to 37 text messages, a voicemail from Claire that started with, "I am so proud of you," and 2 missed calls from board members she'd have to return before noon. She made coffee, took a long shower, and told herself she felt lighter. She did, in some ways. In other ways, she felt something she wasn't going to examine closely for at least a few days. She reviewed the clip someone had sent her. She watched herself remove the ring. She watched Damien pick it up and put it in his pocket. She watched him walk away, and she noticed, this was new, she hadn't noticed it in the moment, that he hadn't looked back once. She set down her phone and went to get dressed. Caldwell Solutions occupied 4 floors of a building on Madison Avenue, and on Monday morning it ran exactly as it always ran, which was to say, with the particular organized tension of a company that had grown faster than its systems and was held together partly by competence and partly by the force of Vanessa's personality. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She'd built the company from a 2-person consulting shop in a WeWork in Midtown into a firm with 240 employees and a client list that included household names. What she hadn't built, because she hadn't needed to, had chosen not to look at too closely, was the financial architecture underneath it, the ownership structure, the quiet, complicated, layered holding situation that her CFO, Gerald Park, had explained to her once in a way that made her eyes glaze over and her mind slide toward the more immediate urgency of a product launch. She knew there was a majority shareholder. She knew this shareholder had been there since the company's early days, had provided the foundational capital that let her scale when she needed to scale, and had remained silent and unnamed in all the years since. She had never pushed on the question. The capital was real. The silence was convenient. She had a company to run. This arrangement was about to become inconvenient. On Monday afternoon, Gerald appeared in her office doorway with the expression of a man carrying news he would like to hand to someone else. "The Hartwell Group called," he said. Hartwell was a large institutional investor they'd been courting for months, patient capital, the kind that understood long timelines. They want to meet the controlling shareholder before they commit. They're not going to move forward without it. Vanessa looked up from her laptop. "We've had that conversation. The shareholder is private." "I know, I told them. They're not flexible on this." She held his gaze. "Then go back and make them flexible." Gerald didn't move. "Vanessa, we're not the only pitch they're looking at. If we lose Hartwell, we lose the expansion runway. The timeline moves back by—" "I heard you, Gerald." She turned back to her screen. "I'll handle it." Gerald left. Vanessa closed her laptop and sat very still for a moment. She needed to talk to the shareholder. She needed to arrange a meeting, go through the usual channels, the series of attorneys and intermediaries who'd always served as the buffer between her operational control and whoever sat behind the curtain. She'd done this twice before, years ago, when specific legal moments had required a signature. The responses had always come back quickly. Signed, no comment, no conversation. A ghost in the machine who stayed out of her way and let her work. She sent the message through the attorney on file. The response came back in under an hour, which was faster than usual. The principal has requested an in-person board meeting this Thursday, 10 a.m., full executive attendance. Vanessa stared at the reply for a long time. Then she forwarded it to her assistant and told her to set it up. She told herself, in the 3 days between that Monday and Thursday morning, that it was a coincidence. The timing. The fact that her mysterious shareholder had suddenly become communicative in the same week that she'd ended her engagement at a public gala. She told herself this was business, and business sometimes moved in inconvenient clusters, and there was no through line connecting a broken engagement to a board meeting except her own tendency to look for patterns where none existed. She almost convinced herself. On Wednesday night, she called Claire. "The Hartwell thing is actually a good problem to have," Claire said. "It means they're serious." "I know." "You sound weird. What's wrong?" "Nothing. Tired." "Are you still thinking about Damien?" The question was sharp and quick, the way Claire always got when she thought she'd identified something. Vanessa didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "Vanessa, no, you made the right call." "I know I did." "He was never going to be the right person. You need someone who—" "I said I know, Claire." Her voice came out harder than she intended. "I'll talk to you later." She hung up. In her apartment, the one she'd designed to look exactly the way she thought she should live, and listened to the city outside the window. She was not thinking about Damien. She poured a glass of water and took it to bed and lay there for a while in the dark, not thinking about the way he'd said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." Not thinking about the fact that he hadn't raised his voice or his shoulders or his chin or any of the usual armor. Not thinking about the ring, sitting in the breast pocket of his jacket, buttoned in. She was not thinking about any of that. She turned over and closed her eyes and told herself Thursday would be straightforward. A meeting, a business matter. The kind of thing she handled every week. Outside, the city made its noise, indifferent as always to whatever a person was choosing not to think about at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. Thursday was coming. And Damien Sterling, in a quiet apartment 12 blocks away, was putting his daughter to bed and checking his calendar one more time, calm, unhurried, in the specific and patient way of a man who has been waiting a long time for the right moment and knows, with absolute certainty, that it has finally arrived. Thursday arrived the way bad news tends to arrive, quietly, without warning signs, wearing the ordinary face of a regular morning. Vanessa was in the office by 8:15, which was earlier than usual but not unusual enough for anyone to comment. She'd slept badly. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of sleeplessness, where you stare at the ceiling processing profound thoughts, but the grinding, low-grade kind where you drift in and out and wake up feeling like you never closed your eyes at all. She'd made coffee at home, drunk half of it, left the rest on the counter, and taken a car to the office because she didn't trust herself on the subway when her mind was doing this. She reviewed the board attendance list at her desk. 12 names, all confirmed. Gerald Park, CFO. Patricia Huang, EVP of Operations. Marcus Holloway, Chief Strategy Officer, who had been at the company longer than anyone except Vanessa herself, and who had a way of filling every room he entered with the weight of his own opinions. The heads of legal, finance, product. 2 independent directors whose main function was to look thoughtful during quarterly reviews. And 1 name she didn't recognize. Listed at the bottom of the confirmation, added by whoever had arranged the meeting on the principal's side. D. Sterling, principal representative. She read it twice. Then she put the paper face down on her desk and sat for a moment doing nothing. Sterling was not an uncommon name. She was being paranoid. She'd been short on sleep and long on anxiety for 3 days, and her mind was manufacturing connections that didn't exist. She picked up her phone, started to call Gerald, then put it back down. There was no useful question she could ask him. He knew less than she did. At 9:55, she walked to the boardroom. The room was already mostly full. Gerald was in his usual spot, 2 seats from the head of the table, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Marcus was beside him, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who assumed most meetings were designed for his benefit. Patricia was at the far end, talking quietly to the head of legal, a careful, measured woman named Diane Marsh, who had the kind of face that gave nothing away even on ordinary days. The two independent directors, Howard Bell and Sylvia Reeves, were seated and silent in the way people sit when they're not sure what they've been called in for. The rest of the executive team filled the remaining chairs. The chair at the head of the table was empty. There was also a chair to the right of it, which was the kind of chair that gets placed when someone important is expected, and which was also empty. The assistant who'd set up the room had left a water glass at both seats. Someone had placed a slim leather portfolio in front of the head chair, closed, with no visible markings. Vanessa sat in her usual position, second from the head, left side, and folded her hands on the table and looked at her executive team and waited. At 10 o'clock exactly, the door opened. Thomas Wren came in first. He was one of the senior partners at Wren, Albright and Cho, and she knew him by sight because they'd used the firm for two significant contract negotiations years ago. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, a man who dressed with the quiet authority of someone who has never once needed to prove anything to anyone. He nodded at the room, took the chair to the right of the head seat, and placed his briefcase on the floor beside him. No one else came in immediately. The room held. Marcus broke the silence first because Marcus always broke silences that weren't his to break. "Wren," he said, by way of acknowledgement, "you're representing the principal today?" "That's correct," Wren said. He didn't elaborate. "And the principal is present," said a voice from the doorway. The room turned. Damian Sterling walked in. He was wearing a suit she hadn't seen before, charcoal gray, well cut, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is quietly, unmistakably expensive. He wasn't wearing a tie. He carried nothing in his hands. He moved through the door and into the room without any of the self-consciousness she might have expected from someone entering a space they weren't supposed to belong in, and he walked directly to the chair at the head of the table and sat down. The silence was total and absolute in the way that silences only become when something has occurred that the human brain requires a full second to process. Vanessa's hands were still folded on the table. She became aware of them suddenly, the pressure of her own fingers, the coolness of her own skin. She did not move. Gerald Park had taken off his reading glasses. Howard Bell was sitting up very straight. Patricia Huang was staring at Damien with an expression that was somewhere between recognition and something else, something that wasn't quite surprise. Marcus said, "I'm sorry, who—" "Damian Sterling," Damien said. He looked at Marcus with the same particular quality of attention he gave everything, unhurried, complete. "The controlling shareholder of Caldwell Solutions, 62%, through Sterling Capital Holdings." He paused. "I've read your file, Mr. Holloway. We'll get to that." Marcus's expression did something complicated. He looked at Wren. Wren was reviewing documents in his portfolio with the serenity of a man who had known this moment was coming for some time. Damien opened the leather portfolio in front of him and removed a single sheet of paper, which he placed flat on the table without handing it around. "I want to start by being clear about something," he said, addressing the full room but not performing it, no theatrical sweep of the eye, no pause for effect. Just a man in a room, talking to people. "I've held this position since the company was incorporated. I provided the seed capital, I structured the holding entity, and I've maintained a deliberate distance from operations because that was the appropriate arrangement for the first phase of this business. That phase is over." He looked at Vanessa then. For the first time since walking in, he looked directly at her. Her face did not change. She had spent 14 months learning how to read his face, and she could not read it now. It was not cold. It was not triumphant. It was simply present. He was simply there, in the room, in the chair, in the reality that she was only now understanding had always existed beneath the one she thought she lived in. "Ms. Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was level. She was grateful for that, the levelness of her own voice. "I'm not here to disrupt what you've built," he said. "Operationally, this company is strong. Your client relationships, your team, your product positioning, that work is real, and it belongs to you." He said this without softness, without cruelty, as a statement of fact. "What I'm here to address are some structural concerns that have developed over the past 18 months and that require direct oversight going forward." "What kind of structural concerns?" Marcus said. His voice had recovered its usual weight, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. A new quality, careful and watchful. Damien looked at him. "The kind we'll discuss in detail." But not all of it today, and not all of it in this room. He reached into the portfolio again and produced a second document, this one printed on letterhead that Vanessa recognized as Ren Albright's. Effective today, I'm resuming an active chairman role. Thomas will stay on as legal counsel to the principal. I'm requesting full financial disclosure going back 30 months. Gerald, that means everything, including the accounts I'm not currently listed on. He said this without accusation, directly at Gerald, who was already nodding with the pale, careful expression of a man who had a lot to say and no idea when to say it. Full board meetings will resume on a monthly basis, Damien continued. The next one is in 4 weeks. I'd like updated P&L, client retention data, and a breakdown of the strategy department's discretionary budget since the last audit. His eyes moved back to Marcus. All of it. The room was extremely quiet. Marcus was the first person to try to speak again. He had a particular talent for reasserting himself in environments that had shifted against him. Vanessa had always found it useful, had sometimes leaned on it, and was now seeing it from a different angle entirely. With respect, he said, and the phrase landed the way it always did when Marcus used it, which was to say, as a prelude to something respectful in structure only, this is fairly abrupt. The team deserves some context about why now, why this specific, because I own 62% of this company, Damien said. That's the context. Marcus stopped. Thomas Wren looked up from his portfolio for the first time. He glanced at Marcus with a calm, medically precise attention, and then back at his documents. Damien had already moved on. He asked Gerald a direct question about the Hartwell Group's timeline, and Gerald answered it, and they had a brief, focused exchange about the terms of the proposed investment that was completely fluent on Damien's side. Not performed fluency, not a man reading from notes, but someone who knew the landscape of this business with a granular familiarity that could not have been assembled in 3 days. He knew the company. He had always known the company. Every number, every client, every operational seam. He had been watching from a distance the way you watch something you care about but have decided not to touch. Vanessa sat through the next 40 minutes in a state she could not have accurately described to anyone who asked. She contributed when asked, and Damien asked her several direct questions, none of them loaded, all of them genuinely operational, and she answered them and asked her own questions in return, and they had a working conversation about the business in the middle of a boardroom surrounded by 12 people who were still recalibrating the entire shape of reality. At one point, Marcus tried to redirect a line of questioning toward territory that would have allowed him to position himself as indispensable, a move she'd seen him execute on external clients, on potential partners, on anyone who needed to be convinced that Marcus Holloway was the axis around which the important decisions turned. It was a smooth maneuver. She'd admired it before. Damien didn't interrupt it. He let Marcus make his case, asked 2 specific follow-up questions that sounded neutral and were not, and then said, "We'll pull the discretionary reports before we make any decisions about department priorities." And that was the end of it. Marcus sat back. The meeting closed at 11:45. People gathered their things with the muted, careful energy of a group that has a great deal to process privately and no immediate forum to process it in. Diane Marsh, the head of legal, paused near the door to exchange a word with Thomas Wren in a low voice. Gerald Park was already on his phone. The independent directors moved in quiet tandem toward the elevator bank. Patricia passed Vanessa near the exit and said nothing, but her eyes said something. Vanessa wasn't entirely sure what. She nodded at Patricia and walked toward the window at the end of the hallway, the one that overlooked the mid-block construction that had been going on for 8 months, and that she'd stopped seeing entirely, the way you stop seeing things that have always been there. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn around. She already knew. "I'd like to schedule time with you this week," Damien said. He was standing a few feet away, not crowding her. "There are some operational questions I'd rather discuss without the full room." "That's fine," she said. She kept looking at the window. "Thursday afternoon works for me, if it works for you." "I'll have my assistant confirm it." A pause. Outside, a piece of construction equipment made a reversing sound, that steady mechanical beeping. "Vanessa," he said. She turned, because not turning would have been its own kind of statement, and she wasn't willing to make it. His face was exactly the same as it had been in the meeting, not gloating, not closed off. Not the face of a man savoring a reversal. He looked like himself, the self she had known across 14 months of dinners and weekends and quiet evenings and Lily's soccer games, and that was somehow harder to absorb than any version of triumph would have been. "This is about the company," he said. "Only the company." "I know," she said. He held her gaze for one more second, then nodded and walked back toward the boardroom where Thomas Wren was waiting with the portfolio under his arm. She turned back to the window. The construction equipment was still beeping. She pressed two fingers against the cold glass and stood there and let herself feel the full weight of what she had not understood until this morning, that the man she had returned a ring to in front of 200 people, the man she had publicly described as someone who didn't matter, the man who had walked out of her party without a single word of self-defense. That man had owned 62% of her company for the entire length of time she had known him. He had sat across from her at dinner tables and helped Lily with a school project about ocean animals, and driven her home from events when she'd had too much wine and listened to her talk about her business, with the patience of someone who was not, it turned out, simply being supportive. He had been listening as the person who understood the architecture better than anyone. He had been listening as the man who built the foundation she'd built everything else on top of. And he had never said a word. She pulled her hand from the glass and straightened up and smoothed the front of her jacket. Down the hallway she could hear voices, Marcus's among them, lower and faster than usual. She had a company to run. She had always had a company to run. That part, at least, had not changed. But everything she thought she knew about how she'd run it, who she'd run it for, and what it meant that she'd run it well, all of that was sitting differently now, at an angle that was going to take some time to understand. She walked back toward her office, past Marcus in the hallway without stopping. He started to say something, and she kept walking, not because she was avoiding him, not yet, not consciously, but because she needed 30 seconds alone in a room with the door closed before she could be available to anyone else. She got to her office. She closed the door. She sat at her desk. On the surface of the desk, where she'd put it face down that morning, was the list of board attendees. She turned it over, read the last line again. D. Sterling, Principal Representative. She thought about the night of the gala, about the ring on the champagne glass, about the applause, about the woman near the back who'd said good for her, and the way it had felt in that moment, like vindication. She thought about Damien walking out of the ballroom into the October night with the ring in his breast pocket and his face completely composed, and she understood now what she hadn't understood then, that the composure had nothing to do with defeat. It had nothing to do with shame or humiliation or the quiet acceptance of a man who had nothing to fight back with. He had walked out of that room carrying something she couldn't see. He had walked out knowing exactly what Thursday morning looked like. She pressed her fingertips against her eyes, held them there for 3 seconds. Then she dropped her hands, pulled her laptop toward her, and opened her email. She had work to do. She had always had work to do. That, at least, she knew how to hold on to. In the boardroom down the hall, Damien was finishing a conversation with Thomas Wren about the documentation they'd need before the next phase could begin. Wren was thorough, always had been, the kind of attorney who treated every loose end as a potential liability and tied them all before moving forward. "The Holloway matter," Wren said, not looking up from his notes. "How do you want to handle the timeline?" "Carefully," Damien said. "I want everything documented before we make a move. No shortcuts." Wren nodded, still writing. "And Miss Caldwell?" Damien was quiet for a moment. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, he could see the hallway where she'd been standing a few minutes ago. It was empty now. "She built something real," he said finally. "Whatever else is true, that's true." Wren looked up at that. He had known Damien for 11 years. He'd seen him make a lot of decisions, and he'd learned not to read into the ones that came out quietly. "Thursday's confirmed on my end," Wren said, and went back to his notes. Damien picked up the leather portfolio and closed it and stood up. Through the window that faced Madison Avenue, the city was doing what it always did, moving, generating, folding each individual story into its own enormous noise. 12 floors below, people were walking to lunch and taking calls and arguing about cabs, and none of them had any idea what had just happened in a boardroom above their heads. That was fine. It had always been fine with him, the not knowing. He'd spent years being the thing people didn't see, and there was a freedom in that, even when it cost something. It had cost something. He wasn't pretending it hadn't. He thought briefly of Lily, who would be at school right now, probably doing something with fractions that she found deeply offensive, and who had asked him last night, with the directness of an 8-year-old who doesn't know yet how to soften a question. "Daddy, is Miss Nessa not coming anymore?" He'd sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before answering that one. "Not for a while," he'd said. Lily had processed this with the solemnity she reserved for things she sensed were more complicated than they looked. "Did she do something mean?" "It's complicated, Bug." "That means yes," Lily said. And then, with the merciless efficiency of a child who has decided something, "Okay, we'll be fine." He had laughed, genuinely, for the first time in days. "Yeah," he said, "we'll be fine." He carried that with him now, out of the boardroom and toward the elevator. Lily's verdict, delivered with the absolute confidence of someone who had not yet learned to doubt herself and was not, if he had anything to say about it, going to learn any time soon. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. The work was just beginning, and he knew it. The Holloway situation was going to be ugly before it was resolved. The financial disclosure was going to surface things he suspected but hadn't confirmed. The company was going to go through a period of turbulence that would test every person in that boardroom and a number of people who hadn't been in it. But the foundation was solid. He'd made sure of that years ago, when he'd written the first check and set the first legal structure in place, and made a decision that most people in his position would not have made. To step back, to stay quiet, to let the thing grow in the hands of someone who was genuinely good at growing things. He'd been right about that. Whatever else had gone wrong, he'd been right about that. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the marble floor, and the revolving glass entrance and the ordinary Monday noise of Midtown Manhattan, and Damian Sterling walked out into it the same way he'd walked into every room for the past 11 years, without announcing himself, without looking for acknowledgement, carrying everything he needed entirely on the inside. The Thursday meeting. Damian had requested happened in a small conference room on the 11th floor. Not the boardroom, which carried too much weight now, too much of what had already occurred in it. And it lasted 2 hours and ran the way working meetings run when both people are professionals who have decided, without discussing it, to keep things professional. They talked about Hartwell. They talked about the Q4 client pipeline. They talked about a staffing gap in the product division that Vanessa had been meaning to address for 6 weeks and hadn't gotten to. Damian asked good questions, specific, operational, the kind that told her he'd been reading financials and internal reports with the same attention he gave everything, and she answered them directly. And twice she pushed back on an assumption he'd made, and both times he adjusted without making a thing of it. It was, by every functional measure, a productive meeting. They did not talk about the gala. They did not talk about the ring or the applause or the walk across a ballroom floor or anything that had happened in the 3 weeks since October. By unspoken agreement, those things existed in a separate compartment that neither of them was opening today. When it was over, Damian gathered his notes and stood up and said, "Same time next week?" And Vanessa said yes, and he left, and she sat alone in the small conference room for about 4 minutes, doing nothing in particular before going back to her office. It was Patricia who said, the following Monday, what several people were clearly thinking. She came into Vanessa's office at the end of the day, closed the door without being asked to, and sat down across the desk with the expression of someone who has been constructing a sentence for several days and has finally decided to deliver it. "You knew him," Patricia said. "Before." "Yes," Vanessa said. "How long?" 14 months. Patricia absorbed this. She was a careful person, not cold, but measured in the way people become who have learned that most situations are more complicated than they appear on first contact. "And he never told you?" "No." "Did you ever ask about his work?" It was a fair question. Vanessa had expected something easier. "Yes," she said. He said private investments. "That's technically accurate." "I know." Patricia looked at the window. The construction outside was still going. It was always going. "I watched him in that boardroom," she said. "He knew every number, every client relationship. He knew things about our internal structure that I didn't know. And I've been here 4 years. She paused. "He's been paying attention for a long time." "Yes," Vanessa said. "He has." Patricia stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. At the door, she stopped and turned back with something that wasn't quite a question in her expression and wasn't quite a statement either. "He still has the ring," she said. "Doesn't he?" It wasn't really a question. Vanessa didn't answer it like one. "Good night, Patricia." Patricia left. Vanessa turned to her laptop and opened the financial disclosure Gerald had sent over that afternoon. 30 months of data, organized into folders by quarter, each one annotated with Gerald's precise and slightly anxious handwriting style, and started reading. She was 3 folders in when she found the first anomaly, then the second. Then, at 11:40 at night, in her empty office with the city noise coming through the sealed window, the third. She sat back in her chair and looked at what she was looking at. Her mind did the thing minds do when they recognize a pattern they didn't expect and don't yet have language for. It went still, the way a room goes still when someone enters it suddenly. She sent one message to Damien. It was brief. You need to see the Q3 files from the past 2 years, tonight if possible. His response came in 4 minutes. I've already seen them. She stared at that for a moment. Then she typed, and? His answer, Thursday. Bring Diane. She put her phone face down on the desk and sat in the quiet and thought about Marcus Holloway. Marcus had joined Caldwell Solutions in its 3rd year, when the company was growing fast enough to need someone who could translate Vanessa's operational instincts into scalable systems and external relationships. He was good at his job, genuinely good. The kind of good that's harder to question because it's real enough to give cover to the things that aren't. He had a gift for positioning, for walking into a room and making people feel like they were already on the inside of something valuable. Clients loved him. Investors found him credible. He had a way of being in the center of every important moment without ever appearing to push himself there. Vanessa had trusted him for 6 years. She had defended him in 2 separate conversations with board members who'd raised vague concerns she'd dismissed as personality conflicts. She had included him in strategy sessions that gave him a complete map of every significant decision the company had made or planned to make. She thought about all of this on the drive home. She thought about it in the elevator and standing in her kitchen in her coat because she'd forgotten to take it off. And at 2 in the morning, when she woke up from a sleep, she didn't remember falling into with the specific, clarifying dread of someone who has understood something ugly. Thursday could not come fast enough. It came, the way Thursdays do when you've been waiting for them, eventually and without ceremony. Diane Marsh arrived first, carrying a leather binder and the expression she wore when she had already been briefed and was preparing her responses. Thomas Wren was there for Damien, same as before. Gerald Park came in last and sat down without speaking, which was itself a statement from a man who was rarely quiet. Damien set 3 printed documents in the center of the table. Strategy Department discretionary accounts, he said. 32 months of transactions. I had an independent forensic audit run on them last week. He didn't announce this as a revelation. He said it the way you say something that's been in motion for a while and has now arrived at the table. There are 4 vendor relationships that generated a combined $4.3 million in payments over that period. 2 of the vendors are registered to shell entities. One of those entities has a beneficial owner. He slid the top document toward the center. Marcus Holloway. The room was quiet. Gerald had closed his eyes. Not dramatically, just a brief, involuntary closure, the expression of a man recognizing a thing he had suspected and hoped was wrong. Diane reached for the document. She read in silence for a moment. When did you commission the audit? She asked, looking at Damien. 3 weeks ago, he said. 3 weeks ago was the Monday after the board meeting. He had walked out of that building and started pulling threads the same week. She filed this away without comment. There's more, Damien said. The Hartwell approach wasn't random. Hartwell was introduced to us through a third-party advisory firm. That firm has a consulting arrangement with one of Holloway's shell entities. He paused. Someone was positioning to leverage the investment process to shift equity before the disclosure requirement triggered. Diane looked up. You're saying Holloway was trying to use the Hartwell deal to dilute the principal's stake below majority before the principal became active, Wren said, from his corner of the table. He said it with the complete flatness of a man stating arithmetic. If Sterling Capital's position dropped below 51% before a formal chairman designation, the restructuring would have been significantly more complicated. He knew you were going to move, Vanessa said. She was looking at Damien. He knew before Thursday. Someone told him, Damien said. I don't know who yet, but yes. Marcus had known. Marcus had been moving pieces for at least 3 weeks before that board meeting, potentially longer, and the pieces he'd been moving were designed to limit Damien's ability to take control of his own company. The company that Damien had funded and built and stepped back from with the patience of someone playing a much longer game than anyone around him had been watching. She thought about the dinner 6 weeks ago, where Marcus had sat across from her and talked for 40 minutes about strategic vision and long-term positioning and the importance of maintaining executive cohesion during growth phases. And she had nodded along because it had all sounded sensible, the way Marcus's things always sounded sensible, and she understood now that she had been listening to a man managing her perception while he moved money behind a wall she couldn't see. "What do we do?" she said. It wasn't a question with a soft answer, and she wasn't asking for one. "Diane files for immediate removal on grounds of financial misconduct," Damien said. "Wren's team has prepared the documentation package. We don't offer a negotiated exit. We don't let him resign quietly and walk away with a reference." He looked at Diane. "This goes to the board formally, and it goes to the relevant authorities. I'm not interested in managing this privately." Diane was nodding slowly, reading a second document. "The evidence is clean. 2 independent forensic accountants and a chain of documentation going back to the original incorporation of the shell entities," Wren said. "It's clean." "He'll fight it," Gerald said. It was the first thing he'd said since sitting down. "I know," Damien said. "He has connections. He'll make noise. There will be—" Gerald stopped, searching for the word. "Disruption." "Yes," Damien said. "There will be." That was the entirety of his response to the question of what Marcus would do. No reassurance, no minimizing, no smoothing of the road ahead. Just the acknowledgement that it would be hard, and the implicit communication that hard things were still worth doing. Vanessa looked at him. She thought, involuntarily, and with the particular sting of things that arrive when you're not ready for them, about the night he'd told her, months ago, over dinner, in response to something she'd said about managing difficult people at work. That the most expensive mistake you can make in any organization is confusing someone's confidence for their competence. She'd written it off as one of those things people say. Reasonable sounding, a little pat. She hadn't asked him why he believed it. She hadn't thought to ask. She looked away from him and back at the documents. "When does this start?" she asked. "It's already started," Damien said. Marcus arrived at the office the following Monday with no indication on his face that anything had changed. Vanessa had always credited him with the ability to maintain a surface under pressure. It was one of the things she'd found reassuring about him for years, and it now read entirely differently, in the same way that a lot of things about Marcus Holloway were reading differently in the retroactive light of what she now knew. He stopped by her office at 10, leaning in the doorway in the way he did when he wanted to seem casual. "Board meetings moved to next Tuesday?" "Yes," she said. "Any agenda I should know about?" She looked at him directly. She had rehearsed this moment in the way you rehearse things that are going to be unpleasant regardless of how well you prepare, knowing you can't eliminate the discomfort, only decide how you're going to carry it. "Diane's office will send the agenda this afternoon," she said. "Standard distribution." He studied her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, like a shadow, and then his face resettled into its usual configuration. "Great," he said. "See you Tuesday." He left. She let out a breath. She hadn't been aware she was holding it. The thing Damien had not told her, in the Thursday meeting, was that Marcus had already attempted something in the days between the first board meeting and that Thursday. She found out from Wren, in a phone call Friday afternoon, that Marcus had reached out to 2 of the independent directors, Howard Bell and Sylvia Reeves, with a proposal to call a special shareholder meeting on procedural grounds, claiming irregularities in the chairman designation. He'd framed it as due diligence. He'd sent them documentation. The documentation included a memo, purportedly from Damien's own legal team, suggesting that Sterling Capital Holdings had failed to file a required disclosure with the state regulatory body when it originally structured the holding arrangement 11 years ago. If true, it would have meant the 62% stake was legally contested. It would have meant Damien's claim to the chairman's chair was challengeable. It was fabricated. Howard Bell had called Wren directly, because Howard Bell was 70 years old and had been a corporate attorney for 30 of them and recognized fabricated documentation the way a doctor recognizes a fake prescription. Wren had gotten the call Saturday morning and by Sunday afternoon had traced the memo back to a document processing service whose client logs were subpoenaed by Monday. Marcus had known. Damien had known Marcus would move. He'd been watching the countermove before it was made. Vanessa sat with this for a long time after the call with Wren. Outside, the construction equipment had finally gone silent, the first time in 8 months that she'd noticed the absence of it, which told her something about how quiet the building felt now, in the days since the architecture of the place had shifted around her. She called Damien. She wasn't entirely sure why. There were things she could have emailed or sent through Ren, but she called. He picked up on the second ring. In the background, she could hear Lily's voice, high and indistinct, and then the sound of a door closing gently. "Ren told you," he said. "Yes." She paused. "You didn't mention the fabricated memo on Thursday." "No." "Why not?" "Because on Thursday I wasn't certain where it came from. I didn't want to say it was Marcus until I was certain." She understood this. The precision of it, the refusal to accuse before the evidence was complete. "You could have told me anyway. I would have held it." I know, he said. "That's not why I didn't." A pause. She turned this over. "You were protecting the case." "I was protecting the case," he agreed. "If it went to formal proceedings, and you'd been informed of an unverified accusation, it creates a procedural complication." She thought about that for a moment. About the layers of consideration that went into every decision he made. Not the show of consideration, not the performance of being careful, but the actual work of thinking through consequences 2 and 3 steps out. She had been doing this herself, in the operational sphere, for years. She had just never seen it from this angle, from the angle of someone who had been on the receiving end of that care without knowing she was receiving it. "Vanessa," he said, "I'm here. Are you okay?" The question was so direct and unadorned that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. She'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something more formal. Something that maintained the professional distance they'd been operating with. "I'm figuring that out," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him since October. He didn't push it. That was something she'd always known about him and was knowing again now, in a new way. He didn't push the things you weren't ready to hand over. "Tuesday will be a hard day," he said. "I know." "You don't have to be in the room for all of it. Diane can handle the formal." "I'll be in the room," she said. "It's my company." A brief silence. "Yes," he said. "It is." Tuesday arrived with gray skies and the particular flatness of a November morning that has decided not to commit to any weather in particular. Vanessa was in the office at 7:30. Marcus arrived at 8:55, 5 minutes before the board meeting was scheduled to start, and he walked to the boardroom with the unhurried pace of someone who hasn't yet read the room. Diane Marsh laid out the documentation in 12 minutes. She was methodical about it, not theatrical, not punitive in tone, just a precise and sequential presentation of evidence that moved from the shell entities to the vendor payments, to the fabricated disclosure memo, to the advisory firm arrangement with Hartwell. And she did it in the specific register of someone who has done this before and knows that the cleaner the presentation, the less room there is for the subject to create alternative narratives. Marcus interrupted 3 times in the first 8 minutes. Each time Diane paused, acknowledged him, and continued. The third time, Ren looked up from his notes and said quietly, "Mr. Holloway, you'll have an opportunity to respond. Please let counsel complete the presentation." Marcus looked at Ren. Then he looked at Damien, who was at the head of the table, his hands flat on the surface, his attention completely still. Something happened in Marcus Holloway's face in that moment. Not collapse exactly. He wasn't the kind of man who collapsed in public. But something moved behind the architecture of his expression. Something that looked like the recognition of a man who has run out of moves and is only now fully believing it. He looked briefly at Vanessa. She looked back at him. She didn't look away. She didn't know what she felt precisely. The anger was there, and something older underneath it, something that felt like the retroactive grief of a trust that had been real on her side and not on his. But she kept her face where it needed to be, which was level, and she did not look away until Marcus did. Diane finished the presentation. The room was quiet in the particular way a room is quiet after something definitive has been said. "Is there a response?" Damien asked. Marcus's attorney, who had arrived at 9:02 and whose presence told Vanessa that Marcus had known exactly what this meeting was, leaned over and said something in Marcus's ear. Marcus listened. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, "We'll need time to review the documentation." "You have 48 hours, Damien said. "After that, the regulatory filings proceed on schedule." The attorney started to object, and Wren said simply, 48 hours is standard. It's generous, actually. And that was that. Marcus left the room without looking at anyone. His attorney followed. The door closed. The remaining people in the boardroom, Gerald, Patricia, the independent directors, Diane, Wren, Vanessa, Damien, sat for a moment in the specific exhausted quiet of people who have just finished something necessary and unpleasant that they knew was coming and are still absorbing the fact that it's over. Gerald said, "He's going to make noise on the way out." "Yes," Damien said. "It'll be messy for a few weeks. Press, maybe." "Probably." Gerald nodded. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, which was fair because the past 3 weeks had been an extended reckoning with the gap between what he'd known and what he'd been willing to look at directly. "What do we do in the meantime?" "We work," Damien said. It was the simplest possible answer and also the complete one. Marcus Holloway submitted his formal response 41 hours later. It ran to 11 pages and challenged the methodology of the forensic audit and questioned the chain of custody on 2 of the documentary exhibits and contained a section, 4 paragraphs, written in the heated, slightly disordered register of a man who has stopped trusting his attorney's advice, that accused Damien of using his ownership position as a pretext for personal retaliation in the context of a private relationship. Damien read it. He gave it to Wren. "I went home and made dinner for Lily, who was having a difficult week because of a falling out with her best friend at school that had something to do with a disagreement over a class project. And he sat at the kitchen table with her while she talked about it, and he listened in the way he listened to everything, without rushing her toward a resolution, without minimizing the hurt, without making her feel like an 8-year-old social pain was a small thing. He did not read Marcus's letter again. He did not call Wren back that night. He ate dinner with his daughter and helped her with her fractions, which she found deeply offensive, and read with her for 30 minutes before she fell asleep. And then he sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee and thought about what came next. The company was going to be fine. The Hartwell deal was going to need restructuring, but was not dead. Gerald had confirmed that Hartwell's managing director had been quietly appalled by the advisory firm connection once it was explained, and had signaled a willingness to continue the conversation on revised terms. The forensic audit was thorough. The documentation was clean. Marcus's response would generate some noise and delay, but would not, in the legal estimation of 2 separate attorneys, alter the outcome. The company was going to be fine. He thought about what Patricia had said to Vanessa, which Vanessa had relayed to him briefly in a conversation they'd had about the week's developments. The observation about the boardroom, about how Damien had known things that even the executives hadn't fully mapped. I thought about 11 years of quiet attention, of being the person who read every quarterly report and every material contract and every significant operational decision without ever inserting himself into the execution of those decisions, because the execution belonged to Vanessa, had always belonged to her, and she had been genuinely good at it. He had not told anyone, not even Wren, the full reason he'd maintained the distance as long as he had. It wasn't only about clean organizational structure. It wasn't only about giving the company room to grow without a chairman who wanted to be seen. It was also about something quieter and more personal. A belief, formed early and held for a long time, that the most honest form of trust is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. That you could back something deeply and completely without requiring it to know you were there. He had believed in this company for 11 years. He had believed in the woman who ran it. That belief had turned out to be complicated in ways he hadn't fully anticipated, but it hadn't turned out to be wrong. He picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down, and went to bed. In the morning, the work continued. Marcus Holloway was gone by the end of November. Not quietly. He'd been right about that, and Gerald had been right about that, and anyone who had spent more than a week around Marcus could have predicted it. He gave 2 interviews to financial trade publications, both carefully worded to stop just short of actionable, both painting a picture of a founder-shareholder returning to wrest control from a management team that had outgrown him. He used phrases like governance overreach and undisclosed conflicts of interest, and a pattern of retaliation that the board should examine carefully. The second piece got picked up by a larger outlet and ran under a headline that Vanessa saw on her phone at 6:40 in the morning and put face down on her nightstand without finishing. Damien's response, when the press inquiries came to Wren's office, was no comment on the characterizations and a brief factual statement confirming the departure and citing irreconcilable differences in ethical standards. That was all. He didn't call the publications. He didn't ask anyone to run a counter-narrative. He let the documentation speak, because the documentation was the thing that was going to matter in 6 months when Marcus's legal challenges had either resolved or collapsed, and the noise between now and then was just noise. Vanessa understood the strategy. She even agreed with it. But she had to live inside the noise in a way that Damien, operating from his measured distance, did not. She had to walk into client meetings where people had read the second article and were watching her face for signs of instability, had to field calls from 3 separate partners who asked variations of the same question in increasingly polite language, which was essentially, is the company okay? And are you okay? And should we be worried? She answered the same way each time, with the same controlled steadiness she'd spent years developing, and went home each evening feeling like she'd run a distance that wasn't on the course map. Patricia noticed. Patricia always noticed things, which was why Vanessa had promoted her twice in 4 years. "You're holding it together," Patricia said one afternoon, appearing in the doorway in that way she had, the door frame lean that meant she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "That's the job," Vanessa said. "It's a lot of job right now." "It's always been a lot of job." Patricia looked at her for a moment. "He's handling it well, Damien. The way he's managing the external pressure, he's not making it worse." "No," Vanessa agreed. "He's not. That's harder than it looks. Most people in his position would be—" She stopped, choosing words. "More visible. More concerned with how they appear." Vanessa looked at her laptop screen without seeing it. "He's never been concerned with how he appears." "I know," Patricia said. "I'm starting to think that's the point." She left, and Vanessa sat with that for a while. The thing about the weeks following Marcus's removal was that the company didn't fall apart, which was, on some level, the thing Vanessa had been braced for without admitting it. She had told herself, in the late-night accounting that happened in the space between going to bed and falling asleep, that the company had survived its founding phase and its growth phase and was strong enough to absorb a disruption at the executive level. She had believed this intellectually. She had not been certain of it in her body until she watched it actually happen. Watched Gerald step into the structural gap with a steadiness she hadn't fully credited him for. Watched Diane manage the legal complexity with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been quietly preparing for this. Watched her product and operations teams continue their work with the particular resilience of people who care about what they're building and don't need external drama to be their reason for showing up. The company held. Not perfectly. There were client conversations that were harder than they should have been, a hiring process that stalled because of the press coverage, a quarterly review that generated more questions than usual and required 2 follow-up calls that would not have been necessary 6 months ago. But it held. She watched Damien in the weekly Thursday meetings, and she watched him in the monthly board meetings, and she watched him once, by accident, in the hallway outside the 11th floor conference room when he was on the phone with someone. She couldn't hear the content. She just rounded the corner and he was there, turned slightly away, one hand in his pocket, talking in the low, focused register he used when he was problem-solving. And she watched him for about 4 seconds before she turned around and went back the way she'd come. Something about seeing him that way, unobserved and simply himself, was more than she could absorb in the middle of a Tuesday. She thought about what she had said at the gala. She had been thinking about it since October, but in the beginning it had been a thought she could set aside, file under complicated and revisit later, because there were too many other things demanding her attention. Now, in the relative calm that followed the worst of the Marcus situation, it began to sit differently. It began to take up more space. She had stood in front of 200 people and told the room that Damien Sterling didn't matter, that he wasn't the right man for the life she was building, that she deserved someone with weight and influence and the respect of people whose opinion she valued. She had said these things about a man who had, without her knowledge, funded her company from its first breath, who had sat in the background for 11 years protecting something she thought she had built alone, asking for nothing, taking no credit, drawing no attention to himself. She had said these things about him, and he had picked up the ring, put it in his pocket, and walked out without defending himself. Not because he had nothing to defend himself with, because he had decided not to. This was the piece that stayed, not the revelation of ownership. She could have worked with that, processed it as a business fact, and filed it into the appropriate professional compartment. It was the decision. The deliberate, conscious choice he had made at that gala to absorb what she'd said and leave without deploying even one of the cards he was holding. He could have said something. He could have said one sentence, just one, and the entire room would have reoriented. He had chosen not to. She didn't know what to do with that. She was still figuring out what to do with that when December arrived, cold and gray, and the city shifted into its winter register. It was the second week of December when she asked him. They were finishing a Thursday meeting, she and Damien and Gerald, the three of them working through the restructured Hartwell terms, which were coming together slowly and with the particular friction of a deal that had been complicated by external events but had not died. Gerald had left first, because Gerald always left with the energy of a man who has more things to do than time to do them, and it was just the two of them and the documents on the table and the sound of the building settling around them. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from the page he'd been reviewing. Yes. She had thought about how to phrase this. She had thought about it for weeks, actually, in the background of all the other things she'd been thinking about, and she still didn't have the right phrasing, so she just said it directly. "At the gala, why didn't you say anything?" He set down the page. "You were holding 62% of the company I just told a room full of people you weren't good enough for," she said. "You had the most obvious response in the world sitting right there. Why didn't you use it?" The question landed between them. He didn't answer immediately, not because he was searching for the answer, she could tell, but because he was deciding how completely to give it. "Because it would have been the wrong reason," he said. She waited. "If I'd said that at the gala, in that room, in that moment, it wouldn't have been about honesty. It would have been about making you feel small." He looked at her steadily. "And I didn't want to make you feel small, even then." She absorbed this. "Even after what I'd just done." "Even then." She looked at the table. There was a coffee ring on the surface near her right hand, pale and incomplete, the ghost of a mug someone had set down at some earlier meeting and not completely under a coaster. She had been in this room dozens of times and had never noticed this particular mark before. She noticed it now. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Vanessa, I'm not finished." She looked at him. "I stood in front of everyone we knew and I said you didn't matter, that you weren't enough. I said it out loud, in public, with a clarity that—" She stopped, restarted. "I was wrong. Not just factually, not just because of what you own or what you built or what you knew that I didn't. I was wrong about what matters, about what I was looking at when I looked at you and didn't see it." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry. That's not adequate, but it's what I have." The room was quiet for a moment. "I heard you," he said. "Not it's okay. Not don't worry about it. Just, I heard you." She nodded. "For what it's worth," he said, "I should have told you. About the company. What I was to it." He looked at the window. "I told myself it was cleaner to keep them separate. My life. And the business. You and the chairman." He paused. "But that wasn't entirely honest. I also didn't tell you because I wanted to know. I needed to know who you were when you weren't looking at any of that. When I was just a man with a kid and a vague answer about private investments." He looked back at her. "You were real with me in those months. You were actually yourself. That mattered to me." She thought about the dinners, the weekends, Lily's soccer games, and the drive home where they'd talked about everything except the things that apparently mattered most. She had been herself in those months, more herself maybe than she'd been in a long time, because something about Damien's complete absence of performance had given her permission to stop performing too. "And then the gala," she said. "And then the gala," he agreed. Something moved across his face. Not bitterness exactly, but the acknowledgement of something that had cost him. He didn't hide it, and he didn't expand on it. "I was listening to the wrong voice," she said. "Claire, the room, the version of myself I thought I was supposed to be." She shook her head slightly. "I'd been building a life that looked right for so long that I'd stopped checking whether it felt right." He didn't answer that immediately. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had always found impossible to perform for, the kind that requires you to actually be present, because it sees the difference. And after a moment he said, "I know." She looked at him. "How?" "Because I watched you, for 14 months. You're good at the performance. You're very good at it. But there were moments—" He stopped. "When Lily fell asleep on your shoulder that time at my apartment. When you talked about why you started the company, the actual reason, not the version you give investors. There were moments when you weren't performing at all, and you were different, better. He said it simply. I fell in love with that version. The sentence sat in the air between them. Vanessa looked at the table again. She wasn't sure what she'd expected from this conversation. Relief, maybe. Or some version of professional resolution, the clearing of an interpersonal debt that had been sitting on the books since October. She had not expected the past tense of fell in love with to arrive like a door opened onto a room she'd thought was locked. I don't know what to do with this, she said. I know, he said. The company, we have to work together, and the... She gestured vaguely at the space between them. Whatever this is. Whatever this is, he said, is not the same thing as the company. Those are separate. You said that before, at the beginning. I meant it then, too. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you... She stopped, tried again. What do you want, Damien, out of this, all of this? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, he wasn't evasive, that wasn't one of his qualities, but genuinely taking the question seriously before answering it. Honestly, he said, please. I want the company to be what it should be. I want the people in it to be treated fairly and paid honestly and trusted to do their jobs. He paused. And I want to have dinner with you again sometime that isn't a board meeting or a Thursday debrief. He said this last part without embellishment, without softening it into something safer. Just put it out there. She felt something in her chest move. Not dramatically, not the cinematic version of a feeling, just the quiet, unannounced shift of something that has been held in one position for too long, finally being allowed to change. That's not nothing, she said. No, he said. It's not. She stood up, gathered her copy of the Hartwell documents. I'll think about it, she said. Okay, he said. And he let her go, the way he let things go. Without grabbing at them, without following up immediately, with the particular patience of a man who had been playing a long game for long enough that he'd stopped confusing urgency with importance. In the elevator, on the way down, she pressed the button for the lobby and then stood very still and thought about Lily falling asleep on her shoulder on a Sunday afternoon at Damien's apartment, the weight of the girl's head on her arm, the way Damien had looked at them from across the room with an expression she hadn't known how to read then and was reading now, clearly, like text she'd finally found the right language for. She walked out into December. The air was sharp and clear. She put her coat on properly, both arms, and started walking. She had things to do. She always had things to do. But for the first time in months, maybe longer, the things she had to do did not feel like a wall between her and something else. They felt like a path. She called Patricia from the street. I need your honest assessment, she said when Patricia picked up. Not the professional version, the honest one. About what? Patricia said. About whether I have been a good person to work for. Actually, not whether I've been effective, whether I've been good. A pause on the other end. Patricia was someone who took questions seriously, which was why Vanessa was asking her and not someone who would reflexively reassure her. You've been effective, Patricia said carefully. I know. You've been fair mostly. You've been demanding. You've had blind spots. Another pause. The Marcus situation. You should have seen it sooner. I think you knew something was off, and you didn't look at it because looking at it was inconvenient. Yes, Vanessa said. That's right. You've also fought for this company in ways most people in your position wouldn't have. You've protected people who needed protecting. You built something that means something to a lot of people who work here. Patricia was quiet for a second. So, complicated. The honest answer is complicated. That's fair, Vanessa said. Why are you asking me this today? Vanessa considered the question. Around her, the city moved in its December pace, faster and slower at once, purposeful and distracted. A man walked past arguing with his phone. Two women shared an umbrella they didn't need, the sky clear above them, habit carrying them forward. Because I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not managing how I look, she said, and I thought starting with the truth was better than starting somewhere else. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's new, she said. I know. I like it. Don't get used to it, Vanessa said. I'm still me. I know you are, Patricia said, and Vanessa could hear the smile in it. That's not the worst thing. She hung up and kept walking. She had another 3 blocks before she reached the garage. The cold was real and specific. Not the abstract cold of a complaint, but the actual cold of the season. The kind that gets in through the collar and reminds you where you are in time, in the year, in the arc of things. She thought about Damien in the conference room, saying, I fell in love with that version without flinching from it, without packaging it into something more manageable. Just the plain thing, in plain words. She had spent a long time valuing the packaging, the presentation, the way a thing appeared in the room. She had been so convinced that these things were the substance that she'd stopped being able to tell the difference. And she'd made a decision on the basis of that confusion that had cost her something. She was only now, with the benefit of distance and the particular education of a hard few months, beginning to accurately value. She wasn't going to let that mistake be the end of the story. She didn't know yet what the next part looked like. That was true. She was genuinely uncertain, but she knew the direction. She had been standing in place for a long time, and she was moving now, and the direction mattered more at the beginning than the speed. The garage attendant recognized her and brought her car around with a nod. She tipped him, which she'd started doing 2 months ago after realizing she hadn't been doing it consistently before, and pulled out into traffic. On the seat beside her, her phone lit up. She checked it at a red light. A text from Claire. Heard the Holloway thing is settled. You okay? Dinner soon? She looked at the message for a moment. She thought about the phone call at the end of October, Claire's voice saying you made the right call. She thought about 14 months of dinners and weekends and Lily's soccer games and a quiet Sunday afternoon in an apartment 12 blocks from where she was sitting right now. And she thought about the woman she'd been at the gala, sure of herself, so completely sure, so convinced that what she could see from where she was standing was the whole picture. She put her phone in the cup holder and drove. Some conversations could wait. She was learning to tell the difference between the things that needed to happen right now and the things that needed to happen when she was ready, and between the person she had been performing and the person she actually was when she stopped. Across the city, Damien Sterling was picking up Lily from school. Lily was telling him something at high speed, something about the class project and the friend, and a development that had apparently resolved in Lily's favor, though the details were coming in the scrambled, overlapping way that 8-year-olds deliver important news. And he was walking beside her, matching her pace, listening to the whole thing without trying to skip to the conclusion. He was not thinking about the conference room. He was not tracking Vanessa's silence or running scenarios about what she would decide or how long it would take. He was walking with his daughter in December, which was, in the final accounting of a person's life, exactly where he needed to be. He had planted things before and waited for them to grow. He knew the difference between tending and forcing. He knew that some things, when you'd done everything you could honestly do, required only patience, and that patience, when it was real rather than performed, looked exactly like this. A man and his daughter walking home in the cold, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Lily grabbed his hand at the corner, which she still did despite recently informing him she was almost 9 and therefore too old for it. He held on. She called him on a Saturday in January. Not a Thursday. Not a working day. Not a board-related context. Not the cover of Professional Necessity. A Saturday morning, 9:15, with snow coming down outside her window in the particular quiet way it snows in January when the city hasn't woken up yet. She stood at her kitchen window with her coffee and watched the street below, and then picked up her phone and called him before she could construct another reason not to. He picked up on the 3rd ring. She could hear Lily in the background, the specific high-frequency sound of a child engaged in something involving either strong opinions or a television. "It's Vanessa," she said, which was unnecessary since he had her number, but she said it anyway. "I know," he said. His voice was the same voice. She didn't know what she'd expected, something different, some new register now that everything was different, but it was just his voice, the same low, unhurried quality. "Hold on a second." She heard him move somewhere quieter. A door. Then the background noise dropped. "Okay." "I said I'd think about dinner," she said. "You did." "I've thought about it." A pause. Not uncomfortable. With Damien, pauses were rarely uncomfortable, which was one of the things about him she had not adequately valued when she had the chance to value it. "And," he said. "I think we should have dinner," she said. "Not a working dinner, not a debrief, just dinner." "Okay," he said. "Somewhere quiet. Not Midtown. somewhere no one's going to recognize either of us and make it into something. I know a place, he said. She believed him immediately and completely, which told her something about how much had shifted in the months since October, since the boardroom, since the conference room with the Hartwell documents, and the sentence that had landed like something breaking open. This week? She said. Wednesday, he said. 7. Wednesday at 7, she agreed. And then, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't be too much or not enough, she said, "Tell Lily I said hi." A brief silence. She could hear the smile in it before he spoke. "She'll lose her mind," he said. Vanessa laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes before you've decided to have it, and it felt like something she hadn't done properly in a while. "Good," she said. "I'll see you Wednesday." She hung up, stood at the window. The snow was still coming down, indifferent and steady, covering the city in the particular grace of things that fall without asking permission. The restaurant was in the West Village, down a side street she didn't know, the kind of place that had no presence online and no reason to. 12 tables, low light, the smell of garlic and old wood, and something roasting slowly. The host knew Damien by name and didn't make a thing of it. They were seated in a corner without being asked about their preference. "How do you find places like this?" Vanessa said, looking around. A couple 2 tables over was sharing something from a clay pot. A man at the bar was reading a paperback with the focused disengagement of someone who comes here regularly and has never been bothered about it. "I walk," Damien said. "A lot." "You walk." "I walk with Lily. We've been doing it for years. You find things." She looked at him across the table. He had not dressed up. He was in a dark sweater and the kind of jacket that's been worn enough to stop trying to impress anyone. And she thought about the gala again, the suit that had been nice but not flashy, the sparkling water all evening, and she understood now that these had not been failures of effort. They had been expressions of a man who had already decided who he was and didn't need the room's permission to be it. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. "We're not starting the evening with this," he said. Not harshly. Just a statement of preference, the way he made most statements. "When do we start with it?" "When it comes up naturally," he said. "Let's order first." They ordered. The food was not fancy and it was very good, the kind of meal that reminds you what food is actually for. She had a glass of wine. He had what she now knew was his default, sparkling water with lemon, which she'd spent 14 months mildly puzzled by and had never asked about directly. "The water," she said. "You never drink at these things." He looked up. "These things?" "Events, dinners, the gala?" She said the last word without flinching, which she considered progress. "I drink," he said, "just not at work, and not when I need to drive." The gala wasn't work. "The gala was full of my employees and clients and a board of directors," he said. That's work." She stared at him. "You were networking, at your own engagement party." "I was present," he said carefully, "at an event where most of the people present were professionally connected to me in ways they didn't know about. I thought some level of clarity was appropriate." She absorbed this. "Did you know, at the gala, did you already know you were going to take the chairman role?" He set down his fork, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd been moving toward it for about 6 months," he said. "The Hartwell situation accelerated it, and," he paused, "some other things." "The relationship," she said. "Yes." She looked at the table. "You were going to tell me." "Eventually," he said. "I'd been trying to find the right—" He stopped. "There wasn't a good way to do it. There's no version of that conversation that doesn't sound like either a confession or a power play. So you kept waiting." "So I kept waiting," he agreed. "And then October happened before I'd found the way." She thought about this, about the layered impossibility of the thing he'd been carrying, the knowledge of what he was to the company, the knowledge that she didn't know, the relationship existing in the gap between those two facts. She had been frustrated with him for things she couldn't name, and now she could name them. He had been slightly withheld, slightly elsewhere, slightly behind a glass she couldn't identify. She had read it as disengagement. It had been something else entirely. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He nodded. "I've been thinking about who I was at that gala. Not just what I did, the ring, the speech, all of it, but who I was underneath it, what I actually believed. She looked at him. I believed that value was visible, that it showed up in the right rooms and wore the right things and generated the right kind of attention. I had been building that belief my whole career. I built the company on it, in a way. The whole positioning of Caldwell Solutions is about visible leadership, visible results, making sure people see what you're worth. She paused. I applied that framework to you. I looked at you and I didn't see the markers I'd trained myself to recognize, and I decided you were less than you were. I decided out loud. In public. In front of everyone whose opinion I thought I cared about. She stopped. I have thought about that moment every day since October. Not with guilt, though that's there too, but with the specific embarrassment of someone who has discovered that the thing she was most sure of was the thing she was most wrong about. He was quiet, the way she'd asked him to be. His eyes were steady on her face. I'm not asking you for anything right now, she said. I'm not asking you to pick up where we left off, or to pretend October didn't happen, or to make this easier than it is. I needed you to know that I understand what I did. Actually understand it. Not as a professional mistake or a lapse in judgment, as a failure to see a person clearly, and that failure was mine. She stopped. She had said what she needed to say. It sat between them, plain and undecorated. Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The company is not the only thing I believed in." She met his eyes. "I believed in you before I believed in the company," he said. "That's why I provided the capital. Not because the business model was sound, it was, but plenty of sound business models fail. Because you were the kind of person who finishes what she starts and tells the truth in the room, even when it's uncomfortable, and fights for the things she's built with everything she has." He paused. "I was right about that. All of it. October didn't change any of it." "October changed things," she said. "Yes," he said. "It did. I'm not going to tell you it didn't." He picked up his water glass, set it back down. "Trust isn't a switch. You can't just restate the position and have it mean the same thing it meant before." "I know." So this, he gestured between them, a small gesture, economical, the way he gestured. "This is going to be slow, if it's anything at all. It's going to be slow, and it's going to be imperfect. And there are going to be moments where I'm not sure, and I need you to understand that going in rather than interpreting it as rejection when it happens." She thought she understood, in that moment, why she had fallen for him in the first place, not in the retrospective way of rationalizing something, but genuinely. This was it. This exact quality. The man who told you the true shape of the thing rather than the comfortable shape. The man who said this is going to be slow instead of everything's fine, let's just move forward. She had spent years surrounded by people who managed her perception, including Marcus, including Claire, including her own public-facing self. And here was a man who refused to. "I understand that," she said. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They ate. The conversation moved, not away from what had been said, but around it, the way conversations move when something significant has been laid on the table and both people have decided to let it rest there without picking it up again immediately. They talked about the company, briefly, and then by mutual unspoken agreement stopped talking about the company. He told her about a trip he and Lily had taken to upstate New York in November, a long weekend in a town she'd never heard of, where Lily had become obsessed with a particular covered bridge and demanded to be photographed on it from 6 different angles. She told him about her sister who lived in Chicago and called every other Sunday and had a talent for asking the most direct questions of anyone in Vanessa's life, a quality that had been irritating her for years and that she was beginning to actively appreciate. They were the last people in the restaurant at 9:45. The host didn't rush them. Outside, the West Village street was quiet, a different quiet than Midtown, less held breath and more genuinely at rest, and they stood on the sidewalk in the January cold, and she thought about the October night outside the Hargrove Hotel, the sharp air, and Damien walking into it with a ring in his pocket and his face composed. And she thought about how much had changed and how much had cost something to change, and how both of those things could be true at once. "Wednesday was a good idea," she said. "I thought so," he said. "Same time next week?" He looked at her. Something in his face, the specific quality she was learning to read again, or learning to read for the first time, since she wasn't certain she'd been reading it correctly before, shifted in a way that meant something good. "Yes," he said. Same time next week. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were actual weeks, with the difficulty and the miscommunication and the two steps forward that sometimes required one step back that actual weeks contain. There was a Thursday meeting in February where a professional tension surfaced between them, a disagreement about a restructuring decision, real and substantive, where she thought he was moving too fast and said so directly, and he didn't immediately agree with her, and they had a conversation that got sharp around the edges before it found its way to a resolution that was better than either of their original positions. They were both quiet at dinner that Wednesday, still carrying some of the friction, and they talked around it and then through it and came out the other side without having pretended it hadn't happened. There was a week in March when Lily got sick, a bad flu, the kind that runs for 10 days and leaves a child wrung out and pale, and Vanessa brought soup to the apartment without being asked, because she'd heard from Damien in passing that Lily was down and she didn't think about it in terms of what it meant or what signal it sent. She just went to the Italian deli 2 blocks from her office and bought the soup and brought it over and sat with Lily on the couch for 2 hours watching a nature documentary about sea creatures that Lily found deeply soothing and Vanessa found genuinely interesting in a way she hadn't expected. When Lily had fallen asleep against her shoulder for the second time, Damien came and sat in the chair across from them and looked at the two of them in the way she now recognized, the way she'd seen from across a room months ago and had finally found the language for. And she met his eyes over the top of Lily's head, and something passed between them that didn't need words and was better without them. It was not smooth. There were dinners that ended early because one of them was tired or distracted or carrying something they weren't ready to put on the table. There were moments when Vanessa caught herself retreating into the professional register, using company language, managing the distance, and had to notice it, consciously, and decide not to. There were moments when Damien's patience felt, from the inside, less like steadiness and more like absence, and she had to learn to ask directly rather than interpret in the old way. But the Wednesdays kept coming. 7 o'clock, the West Village restaurant, or sometimes other places. A Thai place Lily had recommended with the authority of a child who had very strong opinions about noodles. A diner in Chelsea that Damien had found on one of his walks, and that served breakfast all day and had the best coffee Vanessa had consumed in recent memory. The places were always quiet, never anywhere that was performing itself, never anywhere you'd go to be seen. She stopped going to those kinds of places herself, mostly. Not as a rule, she still had client dinners and events that required visibility, but she stopped choosing them for herself. She started to notice the difference between being somewhere because it was the right place for the work and being somewhere because she needed the room to see her in it, and she started slowly to need the second thing less. The Hartwell deal closed in April. Gerald sent a company-wide note with the kind of careful, professionally warm language Gerald used when he was genuinely happy about something and trying not to show how relieved he was. Vanessa read it at her desk and felt something she hadn't felt clearly in a long time. Not triumph, not vindication, but the quieter satisfaction of a thing done properly arriving at its proper conclusion. She forwarded the note to Damien with no message attached. He responded 20 minutes later with a single line. Gerald's been carrying a lot. Make sure he knows you noticed. She walked to Gerald's office and knocked on the open door and said, "The Hartwell close happened because of how you managed the disclosure process. That was you." Gerald looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who hadn't been expecting this and didn't entirely know what to do with it. "Thank you," she said. "Actually," Gerald said, "thank you, Vanessa." He cleared his throat. "That means something." She nodded and went back to her office and sat down and thought about how many times in the past 6 years she had not done that, had taken the result and moved immediately to the next thing without stopping to tell the person beside her that she'd seen them. She had been efficient. She had been focused. She had been in the specific and costly way of people who confuse momentum with meaning, frequently somewhere else when the moment she was in deserved her full presence. She was trying to do that differently now. It was not a transformation. She did not believe in transformations, had grown deeply skeptical of the before and after narrative in which a person is one thing, and then, through sufficient suffering or revelation, becomes another thing entirely. She was the same person. She had the same instincts, the same impatience, the same tendency to move faster than the situation required, and to assess a room in terms of its usefulness before she assessed it in terms of its reality. These things did not disappear. They were in her the way they had always been in her. But she was watching herself now, noticing the gap between what she did automatically and what she would choose deliberately, and in that gap, small and often inconvenient, she was making different choices. Not always, not perfectly, but more often than before, and with the increasing understanding that the noticing itself was the thing, that the gap was not a failure, but the actual location of change. Marcus Holloway's formal legal challenge collapsed in May. The forensic documentation held under scrutiny, the regulatory filing proceeded without the complications his attorneys had threatened, and the two publications that had run his characterizations of events ran small follow-up pieces that said, in the careful language of publications that don't like to be wrong, that the situation had been resolved in favor of the company. He did not call Vanessa. She did not call him. There was nothing to say that the documentation hadn't already said more clearly. She thought about him less than she expected. Not because what he'd done didn't matter. It had cost the company money and months, and the particular invisible cost of trust that has been broken and has to be rebuilt grain by grain, but because he had stopped being the point. He had been a symptom, she thought, of a culture the company had developed in the years when visibility and positioning had been the primary values. When the person who could make something look right had been rewarded with access and influence and the benefit of a doubt that turned out to be expensive. She had built that culture. She had to own that. The restructuring she and Damien began in the spring was not dramatic. It did not involve mass departures or public announcements or a rebranding that declared a new chapter. It involved a compensation structure that was more transparent. It involved a quarterly process by which project teams reported directly to the board on what had worked and what hadn't, without the middle layer of executive translation that had historically allowed inconvenient information to be softened before it reached the people who needed it, unfiltered. It involved a promotion she made in June, elevating a woman named Rosa Chen from the product team to head of strategic development, bypassing two more senior candidates who had better titles and worse judgment. And the announcement of that promotion, and what Vanessa said about why, sent a signal through the organization that people talked about for weeks. Damien had said, when she told him she was considering Rosa, "Tell me what she's done." Vanessa had told him 3 specific things. No resume language, no organizational chart positioning, just the 3 moments in the past 2 years where Rosa had identified a problem before it became a crisis and handled it without requiring credit or recognition for having done so. Damien had listened. "That's your person," he said. "I know," Vanessa said. "I just needed to say it out loud." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because she's not the obvious choice. And I've spent a long time making obvious choices. I wanted to make sure I was doing this for the right reason, and not because I'm overcorrecting." He looked at her. "Is she the right person?" "Yes." "Then it's the right reason," he said. "The obvious choice being wrong doesn't make the non-obvious choice right. But in this case, they're the same choice. Just trust it." She promoted Rosa the following week. It was the right call. Rosa walked into the role with the specific, unshowy competence of someone who has been ready for longer than anyone in the room was paying attention, and within 60 days had restructured 2 processes that had been generating friction for 18 months, in ways that were now, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly fixable. The summer passed in the way summers pass when you are working hard and living in something that is good but still fragile, quickly in retrospect, slowly when you were inside it, with moments that stood out and stretches that blurred. Lily turned 9 in July and had a birthday party at a park in Brooklyn that Vanessa helped organize, not because she'd been asked to, but because she'd offered and meant it. And she spent 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon blowing up balloons with a hand pump that had a loose valve and making a mess of the cake frosting and being definitively bad at both of these things, and laughing about it in a way that felt like something being returned to her. Lily, eating cake with the authority of a person at her own birthday party, had looked at Vanessa with the particular directness that was one of her defining qualities and said, "Miss Nessa, are you and Daddy friends again?" Vanessa had glanced at Damien, who was carefully not looking at either of them and appearing to be very interested in the state of the tablecloth. "We're working on it," she said. Lily had considered this. "Okay," she said, "work faster." And then she went back to her cake. Damien had laughed. The real one, the low one that didn't perform itself. And Vanessa had felt the day settle around her like something she'd been trying to describe for months, and had finally, in the middle of a park in Brooklyn, with cake on her hands and a broken balloon pump, found the right shape for. They were not back to where they'd been before October. They would never be back to where they'd been before October. And this was not a failure. This was simply the truth about time, about what happens to things when they break and are put back together by people who are paying better attention now than they were before. The seams show. The seams should show. The seams are where the work is visible, and visible work, Vanessa was learning, was not the same as weakness. She was learning a lot of things she should have known earlier, and was declining to waste too much energy on the fact that she hadn't known them sooner. You learned what the situation required you to learn. The gala had been a terrible way to learn it. It had also been, in the unsentimental accounting of a person looking at her life clearly, the lesson she'd needed. In September, the company was named to a list of mid-size firms with exceptional governance practices by an industry publication. Vanessa had read for years and had always wanted to appear in for something other than revenue rankings. She sent the piece to Damien. He called her from what sounded like a street corner. "You see it?" she said. "Patricia sent it to me this morning," he said. "She beat you." Of course she did. Vanessa looked out her office window at the Madison Avenue street below. "It mentions the Compensation Transparency Initiative." "I saw that." "That was Gerald's idea originally. He'd brought it up twice before and I hadn't moved on it." "I know," Damien said. She paused. "You knew he'd brought it up before?" "He mentioned it, a while ago." A pause. "He has good instincts." "He does," she said. "I should have been listening better." "You're listening now," Damien said. This was the thing about him still, after all of it, the way he said the plain thing. Not the reassuring thing, not the thing designed to make her feel better than she deserved to feel, but the accurate thing, the one that landed because it was true rather than because it was warm. She had spent a long time finding this quality unremarkable in him, and she found it remarkable now, the way you find remarkable the things you nearly lost. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay." "The ring," she said. "Do you still have it?" A pause. The street sounds on his end, then, "Yes." "I thought you might have, I don't know, done something else with it." "No," he said. She stood at the window. Below, a cab was arguing with a delivery truck about 3 feet of street that both of them needed. An ordinary Tuesday argument about an ordinary amount of space. She watched it and thought about what she wanted to say, and then decided, as she'd been deciding more often in the past year, to say the thing rather than the managed version of the thing. "I don't want you to do anything with it right now," she said. This isn't me asking for that. I just wanted to know it still existed." "It still exists," he said. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They stayed on the line for a moment without speaking. Outside, the cab and the delivery truck had resolved their disagreement, and the street had reabsorbed them both, moving on with the city's complete indifference to the minor dramas of the people and vehicles that ran through it. "Dinner Wednesday," she said. "7," he said. 2 years, counted from the October gala, that nobody in the social pages had forgotten, and that Vanessa had stopped being embarrassed by some time around the spring. Not because it stopped mattering, but because embarrassment requires you to still be the person who did the thing, and she was no longer entirely that person. 2 years after all of it, Damien Sterling took Lily to the park on a Sunday in October while the leaves were doing what October leaves do, and then he went home and changed his jacket and drove to a restaurant in the West Village, where he arrived 6 minutes before 7 and sat at a corner table and waited. Vanessa arrived at 7 exactly. She sat across from him and looked at him in the low light of a place that had never once required either of them to perform anything, and she felt the particular ease of a person who has arrived somewhere after a long trip and recognizes the place as one she was always meant to get to, even if the route had been badly planned. They ordered. The food came. Outside, October was doing its thing, the good kind, the kind with clear air and color, and the particular quality of light that only exists for a few weeks a year and makes everything in it look slightly more real than usual. Somewhere around dessert, which neither of them ate, but both of them ordered because the restaurant made something involving pears and pastry that was worth ordering, Damien reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He set the ring on the table between them. Not in a box. It had never been in a box. Had traveled in his pocket since October of last year on the logic, never articulated, That a box was a presentation and he wasn't interested in presentations. It sat on the white tablecloth, small and quiet and exactly itself. Vanessa looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I'm not asking you to wear it tomorrow," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything by a specific date. I don't have a speech." He looked at the ring, then back at her. "I just want you to know that the question is still there. When you're ready. If you're ready, I'm not going anywhere." She looked at the ring for a long moment. She thought about the first time she'd seen it, the night he'd given it to her, at this restaurant. No, a different restaurant, but the same West Village quiet. And she'd said yes with the ease of someone who had not yet started listening to the voices that would undo it. She thought about removing it at the gala, about the 4 seconds of silence and the applause that came after. She thought about 2 years of Wednesdays, about soup on a sick day and a broken balloon pump, and Rosa Chen and a compensation structure, and Gerald Park finally being told that someone had noticed, about Marcus Holloway and the fabricated memo, and a man who had chosen, when he had every reason not to extend care anyway. About an 8-year-old who said work faster at her own birthday party and was not wrong. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. She held it for a moment. It was lighter than she remembered, or she was more used to the weight of things than she'd been before. "Not tomorrow," she said. "Not tomorrow," he agreed. "But—" She looked at him. "Closer than I was." He nodded, slowly. "Closer than you were," he said, "is enough for tonight." She set the ring back down, and then, this was not planned, it was simply what her hand did. She covered it with her palm, so that it was under her hand and on the table between them, and not yet anywhere else. Just held, just kept, the way you keep things that matter before you've decided exactly where they belong. The restaurant was warm. Outside, October was still happening. The city made its noise, the indifferent, enormous, ongoing noise of a place that does not pause for anyone's story, but that contains all of them anyway. The gala and the boardroom and the recovery and the slow Wednesday by Wednesday reconstruction of something that had broken and had been, in its rebuilt form, possibly more itself than it had been before the breaking. Damien refilled her water glass without being asked, because he'd always done that, had always paid that kind of attention to the small, ordinary needs of the person across from him. And this, Vanessa thought, was the thing that the room at the gala had not been able to see, and that she had not had the eyes to see either. Not the 62%, not the portfolio, not the legal architecture of a holding company built 11 years ago by a man who trusted a woman's vision before she'd fully trusted it herself. This, the water glass. The ring kept, not deployed. The patience that was not passivity but choice. The love that had not made a performance of itself and therefore had not been legible to anyone who only knew how to read performances. She had spent most of her adult life in rooms that rewarded visibility. She had learned the language of those rooms so thoroughly that she'd started to believe it was the only language, that what couldn't be seen from the outside wasn't real, that value had to be announced to count, that the quiet things, the background things, the things that showed up without making sure you noticed, those things were lesser. She knew better now. It had cost her something to know better. Most worthwhile knowledge does. There is a version of this story that is about a woman who was wrong and a man who was right. That version is too simple, and also, in the way of simple versions, a little dishonest. The truth is that Vanessa Caldwell had built something real from nothing, had fought for it daily, had made 100 good decisions for every bad one, and had been, at the gala, the specific and human failure of a person whose framework had finally been tested on the wrong person and had shown its limits. And Damien Sterling, who had been patient and quiet and deliberate, had also been a man who kept a secret too long and trusted the structure of a situation to hold things together that probably needed to be said out loud. They were both imperfect. They were both trying. They were both, on a Sunday evening in October, 2 years after the worst 4 seconds either of them had lived through publicly, sitting at a table in the West Village with a ring between them and the future still open and uncertain and theirs to build. Lily, who had gone to bed at 8:30 on the other side of the city, with the confidence of a child who has decided an outcome and is waiting for the adults to arrive at it, would ask in the morning how dinner had gone. Damien would say it went well. Lily would say, with the exhausted patience of someone who has been waiting on this particular development for quite some time, "Okay, but are you together or not?" And Damien would say, "We're getting there." And Lily would say, "Okay, that's acceptable." And it was. It was more than acceptable. It was the right answer, not because it was incomplete, but because it was true. And the truth of it was not a problem to be solved, but a place they were both standing in together, looking at the same direction, no longer pretending the distance behind them hadn't existed, and no longer afraid of the distance ahead. Some things are not saved by grand gestures. They are built, slowly, by people who have decided, after the failure, after the exposure of what didn't work, after the hard and ordinary work of understanding themselves a little more accurately than they did before, to keep showing up, to keep being honest, to keep paying attention to the small things, the water glass, the soup on a sick day, the ring kept in a pocket rather than a box, the question that doesn't demand an answer by a specific date because the asking of it was already enough. That is not a romantic idea. It is a practical one. And the most durable things, the ones that hold across years and difficulty and the ordinary ongoing weather of a life, are never really the romantic ideas. They are the practical ones. The ones built on what people actually do when no one is watching and nothing is being performed, and the only measure is whether the thing is true. The ring sat under her hand. The candle on the table made its small light. Outside, the city went on being itself, vast and loud and largely indifferent, and inside a corner table in the West Village, two people who had made mistakes and paid for them and kept going anyway, sat together in the quiet of a thing that was not finished yet, but was, at last, being built the right way. She kept her hand over the ring for a long time. Neither of them rushed it. That was the thing about where they'd arrived. After all of it, neither of them rushed anything anymore. Not with each other, not in the way they'd both learned to stop doing the things that looked like progress, but were actually just avoidance dressed up in motion. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You don't have to ask permission," he said. "Old habit." She looked at the candle between them. "Did you ever think about just walking away after the gala? Not the company. Me. Did you ever think about just letting it go entirely?" He didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that his pauses were not evasion. They were the opposite of evasion, actually. They were him refusing to give her the easy answer when the real one was still being located. "Yes," he said. "There were about 3 weeks in November where I thought that was probably the cleaner option." She nodded. She had expected this, and it still landed with a small, specific weight. "What changed?" she said. "Lily, partly," he said. "She asked about you more than I expected. Not manipulatively. She's not that calculated yet. She's only 9. But she just mentioned you the way she mentions things she's still processing, the way she mentioned her grandmother for months after she passed." He looked at his water glass. "And I thought about that. About the things we keep mentioning because we haven't finished with them yet." "And the other part," she said. He looked at her. "I've known who you are since before you walked into a room with a ring on your finger. One bad night doesn't overwrite years of evidence." He paused. "I was angry. I want to be honest about that. I was genuinely angry for a while, in a way I didn't show because showing it in the moment would have made it about my ego rather than the actual problem. But underneath the anger, I still knew who you were. That didn't change." She felt something tighten in her chest and release in the same motion. The simultaneous ache of being known and the relief of it, which she was coming to understand were the same feeling experienced from two directions. "I didn't know who I was," she said quietly. "That's the part I keep coming back to. I'd built such a complete version of myself for public consumption that when it came to the actual private decision, who do you want, what do you value, what kind of person are you when the room stops watching, I defaulted to the public version. I performed my own life at the worst possible moment." "I know," he said. "And you stopped." "I stopped," she agreed. "Eventually." "Not eventually," he said. "You called me on a Saturday in January in the snow. That wasn't eventual. That was brave." She looked at him. "It was a phone call. It was the right phone call made by someone who didn't have to make it and chose to anyway," he said. "That's brave. The size of the gesture doesn't determine what it costs." She thought about that for a moment, about the size of gestures and their cost, about a man who had put a ring in his pocket and buttoned his jacket and walked across a ballroom floor without once looking back, and how that had been, in its complete absence of spectacle, one of the most significant things she had ever witnessed, though she hadn't had the right eyes for it at the time. She lifted her hand from the ring, looked at it sitting on the white tablecloth, picked it up and held it properly this time, between two fingers the way she'd held it once before, though the meaning of the gesture was entirely different now. "When I'm ready," she said, "I want to put it on myself. I don't want a moment. I don't want a setting. I want to just put it on one day when it's true and have that be the whole thing." He looked at her steadily. "That's exactly how it should happen," he said. She set it down again, gently, and slid it across the table toward him. "Keep it a little longer," she said. He picked it up, put it back in his pocket. Buttoned the button, the same as he had a year ago in a ballroom, and the echo of it moved through her quietly, like a note held at the end of a piece of music that resolves into something you didn't know you'd been waiting to hear. "A little longer," he said. "I can do that." Outside, October continued its patient, indifferent work, turning leaves, shortening days, moving the world through its season without asking anyone's permission or waiting for anyone to be ready. The city went on, the candle burned, and two people who had found their way back to the same table by the longest possible route sat together in the ordinary, irreplaceable warmth of an evening that belonged only to them.